Picture a ship, silent and alone, under the vast and empty Atlantic sky. Its sails are partially set, catching a breeze that pushes it gently, aimlessly, across the rolling swells. There is no sign of a struggle, no gaping hole in its hull, no fire-scorched deck, and yet, when another vessel draws alongside, the crew finds only an eerie, profound silence. Every lifeboat is accounted for except one. The crew's personal belongings are still in their quarters. A half-eaten meal sits waiting on the mess table. But the people, every single soul who set sail, are gone, vanished without a trace, leaving behind a perfectly seaworthy ship as a ghostly, floating tomb. This is not a scene from a Gothic novel. This is the real, documented discovery of the Mary Celeste in December 1872, an event that instantly cemented her name in history as the world's most famous ghost ship. For over a century, the mystery of the Mary Celeste has gripped the public imagination, a puzzle so baffling and complete that it seems to defy all logic. How does an entire crew simply disappear? What force, what event could have been so terrifying or so sudden that they would abandon their vessel in the middle of the ocean, casting themselves adrift in a single, small boat, never to be seen again? The ship itself became a character in its own dark legend, a vessel forever cursed by its own inexplicable emptiness. We are drawn to stories like this because they tap into our most primal fears, the fear of the unknown, the fear of being utterly and completely lost. The Mary Celeste is more than just a historical footnote. It is a blank canvas upon which we have projected our deepest anxieties and our most wild speculations for generations. In this journey, we will walk the deserted decks of the Mary Celeste alongside those who first discovered her. We will meet her captain, Benjamin Briggs, a seasoned and respected mariner, and his crew, ordinary men who stepped into an extraordinary and enduring enigma. We will sift through the original logbook entries and the testimony given in court, separating the cold, hard facts from the layers of myth and sensational fiction that have clouded the truth for so long. From giant squid attacks to pirate raids, from waterspouts to mutiny, and even stranger theories involving time warps and malevolent sea monsters, we will investigate every proposed explanation. This is the ultimate deep dive into one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries, a voyage to uncover what really happened to the souls aboard the ghost ship Mary Celeste. To understand the sheer strangeness of the disappearance, we first need to know the ship and the people who trusted their lives to it. The Mary Celeste was not some rotting, ancient hulk. She was a 282-ton brigantine named the Amazon when she was first launched in Nova Scotia in 1861. She had a somewhat unlucky early career, changing hands several times and even running aground once. But by 1872, under American ownership and her new name, she was considered a sound and seaworthy vessel. Her final cargo was 1,709 barrels of commercial alcohol, a common enough shipment, but this was not drinking alcohol. It was denatured or methylated spirits intended for industrial use in Italy, which made it far less volatile and dangerous than many would later assume. At her helm was Captain Benjamin Briggs, a 37-year-old master mariner from a well-respected seafaring family in Massachusetts. Described by those who knew him as a devout, temperate, and deeply competent captain, he was the picture of reliability. This was to be a family voyage. Accompanying him were his wife, Sarah, and their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia. The decision to bring his family speaks volumes about Captain Briggs's confidence in both his ship and the journey ahead. He would have never knowingly taken his wife and infant child into a situation he perceived as unduly dangerous. The crew was small, just 7 men, and by all accounts they were capable and experienced sailors. The first mate, Albert Richardson, was particularly trusted, known to Captain Briggs and considered a steady hand. The voyage began with every indication of routine success. On November 7, 1872, the Mary Celeste departed from Staten Island, New York, her sails filled with a fair wind pointing her toward Genoa, Italy. Just a week later, another vessel, the British brigantine Dei Gratia, left the same port bound for Gibraltar. The two ships were following similar paths across the vast, often empty Atlantic. For the first few weeks, the Mary Celeste's journey was uneventful. The last log entry, dated November 25th, placed her about 6 miles off the coast of the Azores Islands. The notation was mundane, recording her position and the weather, with no hint of distress, no foreshadowing of the cataclysm to come. This is the last known communication from anyone aboard. For the next 10 days, the ship sailed on, a silent, crewless phantom, until her path fatefully crossed with that of the Dei Gratia on December 4th. By then, the world of Captain Briggs, his family, and his crew had already vanished into the ocean's immense and silent mystery. On the morning of December 5, 1872, the routine watch aboard the Dei Gratia was shattered by a sight that would become legendary. Lookout John Johnson peered across the expanse of the Atlantic and spotted another brigantine, perhaps 5 or 6 miles distant. At first, it was just another ship, a welcome break in the monotony of a long voyage. But as the Dei Gratia drew closer, a sense of unease began to settle over her captain, David Morehouse, and his crew. The vessel was under partial sail, her canvas flapping loosely, not trimmed for a specific course. More disturbingly, she was yawing, swinging slowly and unpredictably from side to side in a way that suggested no one was at her helm. She moved like a riderless horse, guided only by the whims of the wind and current. Captain Morehouse, who by a strange twist of fate personally knew Captain Briggs, identified the ship through his spyglass. It was the Mary Celeste, a vessel that had left port before him and should have been well ahead, already unloading its cargo in Italy. He ordered signals to be sent, first by flag and then by a blast from the ship's horn. Each attempt was met with the same profound, unsettling silence. After observing the derelict for 2 hours with no sign of life, Captain Morehouse made a difficult decision. He could not simply sail on and leave what appeared to be a seaworthy vessel adrift, a hazard to navigation and a potential financial loss for its owners. He ordered his first mate, Oliver DeVoe, and 2 seamen to take a small boat and investigate. As their tiny craft rose and fell on the swelling waves, the men rowed toward the silent ship, the Dei Gratia standing by at a safe distance. The first clue that something was terribly wrong came as they pulled alongside. They shouted up to the decks, their voices swallowed by the vastness of the ocean. No one shouted back. The only sounds were the creak of the ship's timbers, the slap of ropes against the masts, and the endless sigh of the wind in her tattered sails. Grabbing hold of the hull, they climbed aboard, stepping onto the deck of a mystery that has endured for over a century and a half. What they found was a scene of eerie preservation and inexplicable abandonment. The ship was, for all intents and purposes, perfectly sound. Her hull was intact, her mast standing, and her cargo of industrial alcohol was largely secure in the hold. There was no sign of a violent struggle, no bloodstains, no evidence of piracy or fire. It was the small, personal details that made the situation so chilling. In the crew's quarters, the seamen's belongings were still neatly stowed. In the galley, the cook had left his utensils clean and orderly. Most hauntingly, in the captain's cabin, a meal had been set out but never finished. The boarding party found the log slate, its last entry noting a position near the Azores Islands 10 days prior, with no indication of distress. The ship's only lifeboat was missing, along with her navigational sextant and the ship's papers. The crew of the Dei Gratia had discovered a fully provisioned, seaworthy vessel that had been voluntarily, and in apparent haste, abandoned in the middle of the ocean for reasons they could not possibly fathom. The stage was now set, not for an answer, but for a mystery that would echo through the ages. As first mate Oliver DeVoe and his 2 men from the day Gracia stepped over the rail and onto the deck of the Mary Celeste, they entered a world of profound and unnerving silence. The ship was a living paradox, a vessel in perfect working order that felt utterly and completely dead. Their first task was a quick sweep of the deck, their eyes scanning for any sign of life or any clue to explain the absence of it. They found none. The wheel spun freely with no hand to guide it, the ropes hung slack, and the sails, though set, were poorly trimmed, some even torn, as if the last person to handle them had left in the middle of the task. This initial survey revealed no immediate danger, no fire, no breach in the hull, no signs of a violent conflict. The mystery only deepened with every passing moment. Descending below deck, the boarding party moved through a ship frozen in time. The crew's quarters were a portrait of interrupted daily life. The men's sea chests were still there, their clothes and personal effects neatly stored inside. More tellingly, the crew's pipes and a supply of tobacco were left behind on their bunks. For a sailor in the 19th century, his pipe was a personal comfort, a small luxury to break the monotony of a long voyage. To abandon it suggested a departure so urgent that there was no time to grab even these cherished items. In the galley, the ship's store of food and water was more than sufficient to have sustained the crew for many more months. Barrels of salt meat and hardtack were intact, and perhaps most critically, there was a 6-month supply of fresh water still in the hold. This single fact alone ruled out one of the most basic fears of any ocean voyage: thirst. They had not run out of water. The captain's cabin offered the most haunting and personal clues. The Briggs family's life was preserved in heartbreaking detail. Sarah Briggs's sewing machine was there, with some of her needlework nearby. The child's toys were scattered on the floor, a silent testament to little Sophia's presence. Most eerily of all, the boarding party found breakfast dishes still on the table, as if the family had been called away mid-meal. There was no evidence of a rushed or chaotic meal. Everything was orderly yet unfinished. This pointed to an interruption that was both sudden and perceived as catastrophic, but one that left no physical mark on the ship itself. Alongside these domestic scenes, crucial items were conspicuously missing. The ship's only lifeboat was gone, clearly launched from its davits rather than torn away by a storm. Also missing was the captain's navigational sextant, and most importantly, the ship's official logbook and registry papers. This was a critical detail. The crew had taken the means to navigate and identify their vessel, suggesting a planned, if desperate, abandonment with the intention of reaching land. Piecing these clues together, the men from the day Gracia could only form one coherent theory. For a reason they could not determine, Captain Briggs had ordered his crew and family to abandon a perfectly sound ship. The act of taking the navigational instruments and the ship's papers shows this was a calculated decision, not a blind panic. They had likely taken to the single lifeboat, perhaps tethering it to the Mary Celeste with a long line, intending to wait out whatever perceived danger had forced them off. Then something went horribly wrong. A sudden squall could have snapped the tow line, or the lifeboat, overloaded with 10 people, could have been swamped by a large wave. The Mary Celeste, freed from the weight of the small boat, would have then sailed on, a ghost ship carrying the full story of its crew's fate locked within its silent, empty cabins. The men were left standing in the quiet, surrounded by the lingering presence of the vanished, tasked with the impossible job of sailing this enigma back to port. Back in the captain's cabin, amidst the scattered toys and the unfinished meal, the boarding party from the day Gracia made a crucial discovery: the captain's log. This wasn't the official, leather-bound logbook, which was conspicuously missing, likely taken by Captain Briggs. Instead, this was the working log slate, a reusable surface where navigational details and daily events were noted in pencil before being formally transcribed into the permanent record. The last message left on that slate, dated November 25th, is the final known communication from anyone aboard the Mary Celeste. It placed the ship safely off the coast of Santa Maria Island in the Azores, noting a position and a routine observation of the weather. There was no frantic scrawl, no hastily written distress signal, no coded warning of any kind. It was, by all accounts, utterly and completely ordinary. This simple, mundane entry makes the mystery infinitely more profound. It proves that as of that morning, everything was perfectly normal. The catastrophe, whatever it was, struck suddenly, and after that log entry was made. The date itself tells a chilling story. The Mary Celeste was found drifting on December 4th. This means that for approximately 9 days after that final, peaceful notation, the ship sailed on with no one at her helm. For over a week, this vessel was a ghost, traversing hundreds of miles of open ocean, a silent witness to its own tragedy. Those 9 days are the true black hole at the heart of this mystery, a complete void of information for which there are no records and, most importantly, no living witnesses. We can only speculate, using the physical clues left on the ship, about the terrifying sequence of events that unfolded in that silent gap of time. One of the most compelling theories, supported by some of the evidence noted by the salvage crew, involves the cargo. The Mary Celeste was carrying over 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol. While this denatured alcohol is less volatile than pure ethanol, the barrels were made of wood, which can expand and contract with temperature changes. As the ship sailed through the fluctuating temperatures of the Atlantic, it is plausible that fumes from the alcohol began to leak from the barrels, accumulating in the hold. Captain Briggs, a cautious and experienced mariner, would have been acutely aware of the dangers of flammable vapors. Imagine the scenario: a crewman, perhaps during a routine inspection, reports a strong smell or hears a hissing sound from the sealed hold. The fear of a catastrophic explosion, a risk no captain would ever take with his wife and child aboard, would have been overwhelming. This perceived imminent danger provides a powerful and logical motive for the single most telling action: the abandonment of the ship. The condition of the vessel when found adds weight to this idea. Reports from the salvage hearing mention that one of the 2 main hatches to the cargo hold was found open, and a sounding rod used to measure water in the bilge was discovered lying on deck near the hatch. This suggests someone was actively checking the hold, likely in response to a concern. Furthermore, the peak halyard, a key rope used to hoist the foremost sail, was found broken with its end trailing in the water. This detail is often cited as evidence of a sudden emergency. The most plausible explanation is that the crew, believing an explosion was imminent, rushed to get the lifeboat launched. In their haste, they may have cut or accidentally snapped that halyard to quickly deploy a sail on the lifeboat to put distance between themselves and what they thought was a floating bomb. They would have taken the navigational sextant and the ship's papers, fully intending to sail the small boat to the Azores, which were just a few dozen miles away at the time of the last log entry. They likely tethered the lifeboat to the Mary Celeste with a long line, planning to follow her until the danger passed, but the explosion never came. The leaking fumes, while alarming, may not have reached a critical concentration, or perhaps the ventilation in the hold eventually dissipated them. The real tragedy likely occurred after the abandonment. The Atlantic in late November is a treacherous place. A sudden squall could have easily arisen, snapping the tow line that connected the overloaded lifeboat to the safety of the larger ship. Or a large, rogue wave could have swamped the small craft, sending all 10 souls into the frigid water. The Mary Celeste, now free and still structurally sound, would have simply sailed away, leaving the lifeboat and its occupants to the mercy of the sea. The ship then drifted for over a week, her partially set sails carrying her on an aimless course until she became the ghostly apparition spotted by the Dei Gratia. The very thing they fled in fear of the ship survived, while they perished in the vast, lonely ocean, victims of a danger that was only ever an illusion. Yet, as compelling as the alcohol fumes theory appears, the physical evidence found on the Mary Celeste presents a series of deeper, more confounding puzzles that complicate any straightforward explanation. When the men from the Dei Gratia conducted their thorough inspection, they noted details that have fueled debate for generations. For instance, they found a significant amount of water sloshing in the ship's bilge, the lowest part of the hull. While some water accumulation was normal on a wooden ship of that era, the quantity reported was enough to cause concern, suggesting the vessel had taken on more water than usual. This was not a ship taking on water and sinking. It was a ship that had clearly weathered a substantial influx of water and remained stubbornly afloat. The presence of this water becomes even more mysterious when paired with the condition of the ship's pump. It was found disassembled, with its components laid out on the deck as if someone had been in the middle of repairing it or clearing a blockage. This suggests the crew was actively dealing with a flooding issue, but the question remains, was the pump broken before the water came in, leading to the accumulation, or was it taken apart in a frantic attempt to manage a sudden, incoming surge? Adding to the scene of controlled chaos were the hatch covers. The main forward and lazarette hatch covers had been removed and were found on deck, rather than securely sealed over their openings. An open hatch is an invitation for water to pour into the hold, especially in rough weather. This action seems reckless, completely at odds with the behavior of an experienced captain like Benjamin Briggs. Why would he deliberately expose his ship to the sea? One plausible explanation is that the crew was desperately trying to air out the hold, perhaps because of those potent alcohol fumes. By removing the heavy covers, they could have been attempting to ventilate the space, judging the risk of a little water coming in as far lesser than the risk of a cataclysmic explosion. This single act powerfully illustrates the terrible calculation Briggs may have faced, a choice between two different kinds of maritime disaster. Then there are the smaller, more personal artifacts that seem to whisper of unseen drama. On the port side railing, a long, deep cut was discovered, a gash that has often been romantically and inaccurately described as an axe mark. In reality, it was more likely damage sustained from rough seas or from another piece of equipment, but its presence has fed countless stories of a violent struggle. Even more intriguing was the discovery of a sword, not dramatically lodged in a mast or lying in a pool of blood, but simply stored under the captain's bed. It showed no signs of recent use, no telltale stains, and was likely just part of the captain's personal effects. Yet, its very existence on board has been twisted by fiction into a murder weapon, a symbol of a bloody mutiny that the physical evidence simply does not support. These items highlight how easily ambiguous clues can be molded to fit a sensational narrative, even when a more mundane explanation is far more probable. Finally, we must return to the cargo itself, the 1,709 barrels of industrial alcohol. While the fumes theory is strong, the condition of the cargo upon inspection creates a paradox. When the hold was finally opened in Genoa, only 9 barrels were found to be empty. The rest were full and secure. This crucial fact rules out a massive, violent explosion or a catastrophic leak as the immediate trigger for panic. If the danger wasn't an actual, ongoing explosion, then what the crew feared was the potential for one. The sight or smell of those few leaking barrels, combined with the creaking and groaning of the ship in the waves, could have been misinterpreted as the prelude to a disaster. In the confined space of a ship's hold with wooden barrels expanding and contracting, the sound of fumes building pressure can be unnerving. For a captain with his family aboard, the mere suspicion of such a threat would have been more than enough to justify the unthinkable ordering everyone into a small lifeboat, believing it was the only chance for survival against an invisible, volatile enemy. Of all the clues left behind on the Mary Celeste, the single most important one was the item that was gone. The ship's yawl, the small lifeboat that had been securely fastened between the main and mizzen mast. Its deliberate absence tells a story more eloquent than any logbook entry ever could. This was not a case of a ship being caught in a freak wave that washed the entire crew over the rails. Nor was it a sudden, violent attack that left no time to react. The yawl was launched, not torn away. This single act transforms the mystery from a passive tragedy into an active, terrible choice. It means that Captain Briggs, in a moment of extreme peril, gave the order to abandon a ship that was, by every physical measure, still perfectly seaworthy. The crew did not flee in blind, screaming panic. They executed a procedure, a desperate but calculated maneuver to escape what they believed was a greater danger still on board. This planned evacuation raises one of the most haunting practical questions of the entire ordeal. The boarding party found a 6-month supply of fresh water still in the hold. Why would 10 people, including a mother and a small child, cast themselves adrift in a small boat without taking an adequate supply of drinking water? It seems like a fatal, almost foolish oversight, but consider the mindset of someone facing what they believe is an imminent explosion. Every second counts. The cargo hold, filled with leaking alcohol fumes, is a bomb waiting to detonate. The priority in those frantic minutes is not a multi-day voyage, but simply putting enough distance between themselves and the ship to survive the blast. They may have taken a small cask of water, believing it would be sufficient for the few hours or days it would take to either be picked up by the Mary Celeste again after the danger passed, or to row the relatively short distance to the Azores Islands, which were visible on the horizon just days before. In the terrifying calculus of that moment, speed trumped long-term provisioning. They were betting their lives on a short, sharp emergency, not a prolonged drift in the open ocean. So, where did they intend to go? The last known position of the Mary Celeste placed her tantalizingly close to the island of Santa Maria in the Azores, roughly a day's sail away for a ship under full canvas. For a small, overloaded lifeboat, the journey would have been far more arduous, taking several days against the prevailing winds and currents, but it was not an impossible journey for experienced seamen. This geographical proximity is crucial. It offers a clear and logical destination, a beacon of hope that would have made the decision to abandon ship seem less like a suicide mission and more like a risky but necessary dash to safety. Captain Briggs had his sextant. He could navigate. He had the ship's papers to prove their identity upon arrival. All the evidence points to a group of people who fully expected to see land again, who believed they were making a rational choice to save their own lives. This line of thinking opens up a profoundly tragic and often overlooked possibility. What if they actually made it? The vast, mostly uncharted coastlines of the Azores in the 19th century were rugged and remote. What if the lifeboat, against all odds, managed to land on a desolate shore, only for the survivors to succumb to exposure, injury, or starvation before they could find help? Or perhaps they were found, but by people who, for reasons of their own, never reported the encounter to the outside world. It is a scenario that feels almost more cruel than perishing at sea, the idea that they were so close to salvation, only to have it slip through their fingers at the very last moment. Their remains and the final chapter of their story could lie in an unmarked grave on a windswept beach, lost to history forever. The alternative, and statistically more probable, fate is that they never reached land at all. The lifeboat, built to hold perhaps 8 people comfortably, was overloaded with 10 souls. It was a small, open craft, utterly vulnerable to the mood of the North Atlantic in late autumn. A single large wave, a sudden squall, or even the gradual shipping of water over the gunwales could have been enough to doom them. If they were tethered to the Mary Celeste by a long tow line, as was common practice in such abandonments, that line could have parted in rough weather. We can picture the horror of that moment, watching the solid, familiar shape of their ship, their only real hope, sail away without them, growing smaller and smaller on the horizon until it disappeared entirely, leaving them alone in an immense and pitiless ocean. The Mary Celeste, the very source of their fear, became the only thing that could have saved them, and it drifted away, empty and silent, a monument to a terrible miscalculation. The lifeboat, the key to their initial escape, ultimately became their coffin. To truly grasp the weight of this tragedy, we need to move beyond the ghost ship legend and meet the man at the heart of it all. Captain Benjamin Briggs was, by every historical account, the antithesis of a reckless or cruel sea captain. He was 37 years old, a seasoned master mariner from a family deeply embedded in the seafaring traditions of Marion, Massachusetts. His life was one of quiet order and deep faith. A devout Christian, he was known to hold Sunday services for his crew and often began his personal correspondence with a prayer. This was not a man given to rash decisions or chaotic leadership. His command style was built on a foundation of competence, sobriety, and a profound sense of responsibility. In an era where some sea captains ruled with an iron fist and a bottle of rum, Briggs was a respected and steady presence, a man whose character makes the idea of a spontaneous, violent mutiny seem almost impossible to believe. This voyage of the Mary Celeste was meant to be a fresh start, a family adventure. Benjamin Briggs was not just a captain, he was a husband and a father. His wife, Sarah Elizabeth Cobb Briggs, was an educated and capable woman from a similarly respected family. Their letters reveal a loving, supportive partnership. She had sailed with him before and was no stranger to the rhythms and rigors of life at sea. Bringing her along, and especially their vibrant 2-year-old daughter, Sophia Matilda, was a decision steeped in confidence. No captain, particularly one as cautious and devout as Briggs, would willingly expose his wife, an only child, to a perilous situation or a volatile crew. The very presence of his family on board is one of the most powerful arguments against theories of a tyrannical captain or a pre-existing plot against him. He was creating a home on the waves, a temporary world for his loved ones that he believed was safe and secure. The portrait that emerges from historical records is of a man who was meticulous and fair. His crew of 7 was small, and he knew his first mate, Albert Richardson, well enough to trust him implicitly. Richardson was himself a married man with children, a steady and experienced officer. The other seamen were, by all indications, competent sailors with no known histories of violence or insubordination. Captain Briggs ran a tight ship, but a just one. He was the kind of leader who inspired loyalty, not fear. This collective profile of the people on board dismantles the more sensational mutiny narratives. There was no simmering resentment, no cruel punishment, no motive for the crew to suddenly turn on a man who treated them with respect and shared his faith with them. The tragedy that unfolded was not born from human malevolence, but from something far more enigmatic and terrifying, a shared, perceived external threat that united captain and crew in a single, desperate act of survival. Understanding Benjamin Briggs as a real person, a man of faith and family, makes the mystery of the Mary Celeste infinitely more human and far more devastating. He was not a character in a spooky story. He was a father who likely tucked his daughter into her berth each night, a husband who shared meals with his wife in their cabin, a professional who took immense pride in his command. When we picture the abandoned ship, we are not just seeing a derelict vessel, we are seeing a home that was suddenly and violently vacated. The scattered toys, the unfinished meal, the sewing machine, these aren't just clues. They are the shattered fragments of a family's life, a poignant reminder that this great maritime mystery is, at its core, the story of 10 real people who stepped off the solid deck of their ship and into the unforgiving vastness of the sea, leaving behind everything but the answer to why. While we rightly focus on Captain Briggs and his family, the Mary Celeste story is also the story of 7 other men, each with their own lives, hopes, and dreams, who vanished just as completely. These were not anonymous, faceless sailors. They were individuals with deep roots and everything to live for. Leading them was first mate Albert Richardson, a 38-year-old from New York. He was far more than just a subordinate officer. He was a trusted friend and a known quantity to Captain Briggs. Richardson was a seasoned mariner himself, a married man with children waiting for him at home. The trust between a captain and his first mate is the bedrock of any successful voyage, and the relationship between Briggs and Richardson was reportedly solid and respectful. The idea that Richardson would suddenly lead a bloody rebellion against a man he knew and respected, a man who had his own wife and infant child aboard, stretches credibility to its breaking point. Then there were the two German-born seamen, brothers Volkert and Bos Lorenzen. Their presence adds a layer of international flavor to the crew, reflecting the multicultural nature of the merchant marine in that era. While we know less about their personal histories, they were experienced enough to sign onto an Atlantic crossing. The rest of the crew was a mix of American and other European sailors, all of whom had passed the scrutiny of both the ship's owners and the meticulous Captain Briggs. In the close quarters of a brigantine, every man's character is quickly revealed. There are no records of any prior disciplinary issues or warnings about these men. They were, by all surviving accounts, a competent and reliable group, chosen for a routine cargo run that should have been a straightforward way to earn a living. To understand why the mutiny theory holds so little water, we have to consider the practical dynamics of such an act. A mutiny is not a spontaneous explosion of anger. It is a deliberate, premeditated act of treason that requires a powerful motive and near-unanimous agreement among the conspirators. What possible grievance could have been so severe that these 7 men would collectively decide to murder their captain, his family, and then somehow disappear themselves? They had not been at sea for an excessively long time. They were not starving or deprived of water, and they were not being subjected to cruel or unusual punishment. Captain Briggs was known for his piety and fairness, not for brutality. Furthermore, a mutiny would have left clear evidence, signs of a struggle, bloodstains, perhaps even bodies. The Dei Gracia's crew found nothing of the sort. The ship was orderly, the personal belongings untouched. It was a scene of planned evacuation, not violent insurrection. Each of these men had a future they were sailing toward. They had families who expected them to return, with wages that would support households back in New York, Germany, and elsewhere. They were practical men making a practical living. Their collective disappearance is made infinitely more tragic when we consider these personal stakes. They were not adventurers seeking danger. They were tradesmen engaged in the maritime equivalent of a long-haul trucking route. Their normalcy is what makes their fate so deeply unsettling. If a crew of proven, reliable men under the command of a respected captain could be wiped from the face of the earth without a trace, what did that say about the safety of any voyage, the security of any life at sea? The mystery of the Mary Celeste is so enduring precisely because it happened to people who seemed so thoroughly ordinary, so immune to the melodramatic perils of pirate stories and sea monsters. The composition of the crew ultimately forces us to look elsewhere for answers, away from the dark impulses of man and toward the unpredictable power of the sea itself. These were men who understood the ocean's dangers, storms, reefs, and gales, and were equipped to handle them. This suggests that what they encountered was something outside their collective experience, a threat so bizarre or so misunderstood that it triggered a unanimous and ultimately fatal decision. The unity of command and crew in that final, desperate act is the silent testimony that argues most powerfully against internal conflict. They appear to have acted as one, following their captain's order to abandon ship, a decision that united them all in a shared and tragically mistaken gamble for survival. At the very heart of the Mary Celeste's final voyage was its cargo, a shipment that has become the centerpiece of the most enduring scientific explanation for the abandonment. She was carrying 1,701 barrels of what was listed as industrial alcohol, a detail that immediately conjures images of volatile, explosive liquid sloshing in the hold. But the reality of this cargo is more complex and less dramatically dangerous than it first appears. This was not the kind of alcohol you would find in a bottle of whiskey or rum. It was denatured or methylated spirits. In the 19th century, to avoid heavy taxes on potable alcohol intended for drinking, industrial alcohol was deliberately contaminated with chemicals like methanol, pyridine, or even benzene, making it poisonous and foul-tasting. This process of denaturing was specifically designed to render the alcohol undrinkable, but it also altered its chemical properties. The key question, of course, is just how flammable this denatured alcohol would have been. The answer is undoubtedly it was flammable. The vapors from such spirits can certainly form an explosive mixture with air, especially in the confined, poorly ventilated space of a ship's hold. The popular theory, and a very compelling one, goes like this. As the Mary Celeste sailed through the fluctuating temperatures of the North Atlantic, the wooden barrels containing the alcohol expanded and contracted. This natural process could have caused some of the barrels to seep, allowing fumes to escape and gradually accumulate in the hold. A crewman, perhaps during a routine inspection, might have reported a strong, pungent odor. Or maybe Captain Briggs himself heard a low hissing or a creaking groan from the hold that he interpreted as pressure building. For a seasoned and cautious captain, particularly one with his wife and infant daughter aboard, the mere suspicion of an imminent explosion would have been terrifying enough to warrant the most extreme action. The fear wouldn't have been of a simple fire, but of a cataclysmic blast that could tear the ship apart in an instant, leaving no survivors. In this scenario, ordering everyone into the lifeboat wasn't an overreaction. It was the only rational choice to ensure their immediate survival. This theory is powerfully supported by some of the physical evidence discovered by the Dei Gracia's crew. The fact that one of the main hatch covers was found removed, lying on the deck, strongly suggests a deliberate attempt to ventilate the hold. It's an action that makes perfect sense if the goal was to dissipate a dangerous buildup of fumes. Similarly, the discovery of a sounding rod left near the hatch indicates someone was actively checking the bilge, possibly concerned about both water and the source of any strange smells. The decision to abandon ship, taking the navigational sextant and papers, points to a planned, precautionary evacuation with the full intention of returning once the danger had passed. They likely tethered the lifeboat to the much larger Mary Celeste with a long line, expecting to follow at a safe distance until the volatile situation on board stabilized. However, for all its logical appeal, the alcohol explosion theory begins to develop significant cracks under closer examination, particularly when we look at the ultimate condition of the cargo. When the Mary Celeste was finally unloaded in Genoa, a thorough inventory was taken. Of the 1,701 barrels in the hold, only 9 were found to be empty. The rest were completely full and secure. This single fact is a major obstacle for the idea of a massive, imminent explosion. If fumes from leaking barrels had built up to a critically dangerous level, one would expect to find evidence of widespread leakage or damage, not just a handful of empty casks. The cargo was, for the most part, perfectly intact. Furthermore, the design of the barrels themselves worked against the theory. These were not sealed, airtight containers. Wooden barrels are naturally porous and are constructed in a way that allows for pressure to equalize. They are designed to breathe, effectively venting small amounts of fumes naturally over time, which makes a sudden, catastrophic pressure buildup less likely than one might think. So we are left with a perplexing contradiction. The crew acted as if they were fleeing an imminent, ship-destroying explosion. Yet the physical evidence of the cargo suggests no such explosion was ever truly close to happening. This forces us to consider a more nuanced and psychologically complex scenario. Perhaps it wasn't the reality of the danger, but the perception of it that sealed their fate. Imagine the scene below decks. The ship is rolling in the swell, its timbers creaking and groaning. In the darkness of the hold, a few barrels are indeed seeping, releasing a strong chemical smell. The normal sounds of a working ship are misinterpreted as the prelude to a blast. In this atmosphere of growing anxiety, a single misinterpreted sound or an overestimated risk could have cascaded into a collective panic. Captain Briggs, with the safety of his family paramount in his mind, may have made a fateful miscalculation. He chose to risk the certain perils of the open ocean in a small boat over the unproven but terrifying specter of a vapor explosion. The tragedy of the Mary Celeste, therefore, may not be a story of a crew fleeing a real disaster, but of a highly competent and responsible man making the worst decision of his life based on a threat that, in the end, was only ever a phantom. When the Dei Gratia finally arrived in Gibraltar on December 13th, towing the enigmatic Mary Celeste, they were not met with praise for their seamanship, but with a thick cloud of official suspicion. The British authorities in Gibraltar, a key naval outpost of the Empire, looked upon the two ships and saw not a rescue but a potential crime scene. The mere fact that the two vessels had left New York within a week of each other and that their captains were acquainted was enough to ignite theories of a conspiracy. The presiding judge at the Vice Admiralty Court, a man named Sir James Cochrane, immediately ordered a detailed survey of the Mary Celeste. For the crew of the Dei Gratia, their hopes of a swift and generous salvage award were about to collide with a legal process designed to be deeply skeptical. The subsequent court hearing was not a modern criminal trial, but a Vice Admiralty salvage proceeding, a legal arena meant to determine who owned a recovered vessel and what reward, if any, the salvors deserved. Yet, the atmosphere in that Gibraltar courtroom felt more like a murder investigation. At the center of this legal storm was the colony's Attorney General and Proctor for the Queen, Frederick Solly Flood. He was a man of formidable authority and unshakable convictions, and he became utterly convinced that a heinous act of piracy and murder had taken place aboard the Mary Celeste. In his view, the crew of the Dei Gratia were the most likely suspects, having somehow disposed of the Briggs family and the crew to claim the ship and its valuable cargo for themselves. This theory, while dramatic, shaped the entire course of the inquiry. For 30 days, the court heard testimony, meticulously dissecting every detail the Dei Gratia's men could provide. Captain Morehouse and his first mate, Oliver Devoe, were subjected to intense and repeated questioning. They described again and again the eerie silence, the undisturbed personal effects, the missing lifeboat, and the general state of the ship. They explained their motives as purely humanitarian and commercial, emphasizing that sailing a derelict vessel with a skeleton crew across hundreds of miles of ocean was a difficult and risky feat in itself. The court-appointed surveyors presented their findings, noting the water in the bilge, the disassembled pump, and the cut on the railing. Every piece of ambiguous evidence was turned over and examined, with Solly Flood probing for any inconsistency that might point to foul play. The single most damning piece of evidence for the prosecution was the apparent presence of what was interpreted as a bloodstain. Surveyors found a discolored, reddish-brown mark on the captain's sword, which was stored under his bed, and several similar stains on the deck railing and on one of the deck planks. To Solly Flood, this was the smoking gun. He immediately presumed it was human blood, proof of a violent struggle. However, the court's own surveyors offered a far more plausible explanation. They testified that the stains were more likely old rust or perhaps residue from wine, preserves, or even paint. Without any forensic science available to definitively test the substance, the bloodstain theory remained just that, a theory, and a weak one at that. It was a classic example of confirmation bias, where Solly Flood interpreted ambiguous evidence to fit his pre-existing narrative of violence. Despite his immense power and his relentless pursuit of a criminal case, Frederick Solly Flood could find no concrete proof to support his allegations. There were no bodies, no murder weapon, no confession, and no credible motive for the Dei Gratia's crew to commit such an act. The idea that Captain Morehouse and his men could have secretly overpowered the crew of the Mary Celeste, murdered 10 people without leaving a single clear sign of a struggle, disposed of all the bodies at sea, and then concocted an elaborate story, all while successfully sailing 2 ships to Gibraltar, strained credulity to its absolute limit. After more than 3 months of legal wrangling, the court was forced to acknowledge the obvious. There was simply not enough evidence to charge anyone with a crime. The case was officially declared unsolved, a mystery of the sea. In the end, the court did award salvage money to the crew of the Dei Gratia, but the amount was a fraction of what the ship and its cargo were worth. The final sum, £1,700, was just a fifth of the vessel's total value. This meager reward was in itself a silent verdict. It was enough to acknowledge that the men had performed a service and taken a risk, but it was deliberately reduced, a reflection of the court's lingering suspicions and its inability to fully accept their story. The ruling left everyone dissatisfied. Solly Flood remained convinced of a cover-up. The Dei Gratia's crew felt cheated after their perilous journey, and the world was left with no answers, only a deeper, more official layer of mystery. The Gibraltar inquiry did not solve the riddle of the Mary Celeste. It merely certified it, transforming a strange sea story into an enduring, legally sanctioned enigma. Given the immense and often lawless expanse of the 19th century Atlantic, one of the first and most dramatic explanations to leap to mind is piracy. The image of a ruthless brigantine flying the Jolly Roger, its crew of cutthroats swarming over the rail with cutlasses and pistols, provides a visceral and terrifying narrative for the crew's disappearance. It is a theory that seems to fit the era, a time when, although the golden age of Caribbean piracy had faded, acts of maritime robbery and violence were still a very real threat on the high seas. The idea that the Mary Celeste was set upon by a predatory vessel, her crew either slaughtered where they stood or taken captive to be sold or held for ransom, offers a grim but straightforward solution to the mystery. The missing lifeboat could be explained as having been either destroyed in the fight or taken by the pirates themselves, and the vanished crew would be accounted for, their fate sealed by human greed and brutality. Yet, when we hold this dramatic theory up against the physical reality of the Mary Celeste as discovered by the Dei Gratia's crew, it begins to crumble almost immediately. The most glaring inconsistency is the complete and total absence of any signs of a struggle. A pirate boarding, even one that was completely one-sided, would have left behind a trail of chaos. Think of the evidence that would be unavoidable: decks scarred by grappling hooks, splintered wood from musket balls or axe blows, the telltale crimson splatter of blood on the planking or the bulkheads. The official survey in Gibraltar, despite the Attorney General's fervent hopes, found nothing of the sort. The ship was orderly. The crew's personal possessions were neatly stowed, the captain's cabin was in a state of domestic tranquility, and the only marks of violence were ambiguous at best, like the cut on the railing that was far more likely caused by chafing gear than a pirate's blade. A violent takeover simply does not leave a ship looking as if its occupants had merely stepped out for a moment. Then we must confront the perplexing matter of the cargo. A pirate's entire motivation is plunder. They sail for profit. The Mary Celeste's hold contained a small fortune in industrial alcohol, 1,700 barrels of a commodity that could be easily sold on the black market or in any number of ports. Yet when the hold was opened, the cargo was almost entirely intact. Only 9 barrels were empty, and those were likely due to natural seepage. Pirates, having gone to the considerable trouble of overcoming a ship's crew, would not simply shrug at such a valuable prize and sail away. They would have either taken the entire ship as a prize itself, a far more valuable asset than a single lifeboat, or they would have spent hours or even days laboriously transferring the lucrative cargo to their own vessel. The fact that the Mary Celeste was found drifting, still fully laden, is perhaps the single most powerful argument against a piracy scenario. It makes no logical sense from a criminal perspective. Beyond the high-value cargo, there were countless other items on board that would have been irresistible to pirates. The crew's sea chests contained clothing, tools, and personal items that could be sold or bartered. The captain's cabin held navigational instruments, firearms, and that infamous sword, all of which were highly prized commodities. Sarah Briggs's sewing machine was a modern luxury item that would have fetched a good price. Even the ship's stores of food and water would have been welcome plunder for a vessel long at sea. But again, the evidence is clear: nothing of significant value was taken. The personal belongings were left untouched, the sewing machine remained in place, and the ship's provisions were fully stocked. This scene of undisturbed property is utterly incompatible with the modus operandi of pirates, whose very purpose is to strip a captured vessel of anything and everything of worth. The Mary Celeste was not plundered, she was simply abandoned. So, while the romance and terror of a pirate attack will always be a part of the Mary Celeste's legend, the hard evidence discovered on her decks tells a very different and far more puzzling story. The absence of violence, the pristine condition of the valuable cargo, and the untouched nature of the crew's personal effects all point away from a human predator and toward a more enigmatic, impersonal threat. The pirates of the Atlantic were many things, but they were not ghosts. They left evidence of their passing. Whoever or whatever caused the crew of the Mary Celeste to vanish left behind no such calling card, forcing us to look beyond the cutlass and the cannon and into the realm of the sea's own strange and unpredictable power. The idea of a mutiny is one of the most human and dramatic explanations for the Mary Celeste's fate. A story of rebellion that pits a tyrannical captain against a desperate crew pushed to the brink. After all, the 19th century was filled with tales of brutal skippers and the men who rose up against them, and the claustrophobic pressure of a long sea voyage could certainly fray the nerves of even the most seasoned sailors. In the close quarters of a brigantine, with weeks of isolation and the constant strain of navigating treacherous waters, a single spark of conflict could theoretically ignite into a full-blown insurrection. The theory suggests that for some unknown reason, the crew turned on Captain Briggs, murdering him and his family before commandeering the ship for their own purposes, only to later perish in the lifeboat themselves. Yet, when we scrutinize this narrative against the known character of Benjamin Briggs, the entire premise begins to falter. This was not a cruel taskmaster known for doling out harsh punishments or withholding rations. By every historical account, Briggs was a man of profound faith and steady temperament, a captain who led through competence and respect rather than fear and intimidation. He was the kind of commander who held Sunday services for his men, a practice that speaks to a sense of community and shared values, not division and tyranny. His decision to bring his wife and 2-year-old daughter on the voyage is perhaps the most powerful testament to his character. No captain with a volatile temper or a history of conflict with his crew would ever willingly expose his own family to that environment. The presence of Sarah and Sophia Briggs is a silent but undeniable argument for a harmonious ship. Furthermore, the physical evidence discovered on the Mary Celeste paints a picture that is completely at odds with a violent uprising. A mutiny, especially one that results in the murder of a captain and his entire family, is an inherently messy and chaotic affair. It would have left unmistakable traces: overturned furniture, bloodstains on the deck or walls, signs of a frantic struggle in the captain's quarters. The Gibraltar court's own surveyors, who were actively searching for evidence of foul play, found nothing of the sort. The ship was in a state of orderly abandonment, not violent takeover. The crew's personal belongings, including their cherished pipes and tobacco, were left neatly in their quarters. Mutineers planning to start a new life under new identities would have almost certainly ransacked the ship for anything of value, from the captain's navigational instruments to the crew's own sea chests. They did not. The composition of the crew itself also argues against a conspiracy. First Mate Albert Richardson was a trusted and experienced officer, a family man himself with a solid reputation. The idea that he would suddenly lead a murderous revolt against a captain he knew and respected, and that the rest of the crew would unanimously follow him in slaughtering an innocent woman and child, requires a motive that simply does not exist in the historical record. There were no reported grievances, no history of disciplinary action, and no financial desperation that would have driven them to such an extreme act. The unity required for a successful mutiny is immense, and the lack of any plausible motive among these particular men makes the theory profoundly unlikely. The evidence points not to a schism between captain and crew, but to a shared, unifying terror that compelled them to act as one, leaving behind their ship and their lives in a desperate and tragically misguided bid for survival. Of course, no historical mystery would be complete without a dive into the realm of the truly sensational, and the Mary Celeste proved to be the perfect catalyst for the wildest speculations. In the decades following her discovery, as the hard facts began to blur with legend, a particularly thrilling theory captured the public's imagination: the idea that the crew had fallen victim to a monstrous denizen of the deep. Picture a scene of pure maritime horror, a calm sea suddenly broken by the writhing, colossal arms of a giant squid, erupting from the depths to wrap around the hull, plucking screaming sailors from the deck before dragging them into the abyss. This image, straight from the pages of a Victorian adventure novel, provided a dramatic and terrifyingly simple answer to the question of where the crew had gone. They hadn't abandoned ship, they were taken. This theory found fertile ground in the sensationalist penny press of the late 19th century. Newspapers, always eager to sell copies, understood that a straightforward story about leaking barrels of alcohol couldn't compete with the spine-tingling allure of an unknown sea monster. The mystery of the Mary Celeste was a blank canvas, and editors filled it with the most lurid colors they could invent. Stories circulated of gigantic, sucker-marked tentacles found on the deck, or of a single, horrifying giant eye witnessed by a lone survivor who later perished. These tales tapped into a very real and ancient fear of the ocean's uncharted depths, a place that was, at the time, far less understood than the surface of the moon. The idea of a kraken-like beast provided a mythological scale for a tragedy that seemed to demand an equally grand explanation. Let's entertain this possibility for a moment, examining it not as myth, but as a hypothetical marine event. The giant squid Architeuthis dux is a very real creature, and while rarely seen, it is capable of reaching immense sizes with tentacles stretching over 30 feet. Could such an animal have attacked the Mary Celeste? In theory, yes. A squid might mistake the dark hull of a brigantine for a whale, a natural predator, and initiate an attack. The initial chaos could have been terrifying: the slap of a massive tentacle on the deck, the ship shuddering from an unseen force below the waterline. In this scenario, the crew, in a blind panic, might have launched the lifeboat to escape the immediate danger, only to be lost at sea while the squid, realizing its mistake, simply released the ship and retreated into the deep. However, when we apply the cold light of modern marine biology and compare this theory to the documented evidence, it quickly unravels. The most significant problem is the complete lack of any physical damage consistent with such an assault. A giant squid is a powerful animal, but it is not a battering ram. Its weapons are its tentacles and suckers, which are lined with sharp, claw-like rings designed to grip slippery prey. An attack on a wooden ship would have left unmistakable evidence. The deck and rails would have been scarred by these claws, leaving deep, parallel scratches and gouges in the wood. The crew of the Dei Gratia, who conducted a meticulous inspection, found no such markings. Furthermore, the squid suckers would have left distinct, circular bruises or even torn away splinters of wood. None were reported. Beyond the lack of defensive wounds on the ship itself, we have to consider the behavior of the creature. The giant squid is a deep-water animal, an elusive ghost of the abyss that almost never interacts with surface vessels. It is not an aggressive hunter of large, inanimate objects like ships. Its prey consists of fish and other squid in the deep sea. An attack at the surface would be an extreme aberration, a case of mistaken identity that would likely end as quickly as it began. Most tellingly, if a squid had been engaged in a struggle violent enough to cause a crew to abandon ship, there would have been signs of a frantic, desperate fight. Ropes would be tangled, equipment knocked over, and the ship's wheel might have been damaged as the creature thrashed against the hull. The Mary Celeste was found in a state of orderly abandonment, not post-battle chaos. The quiet, preserved scene of a half-eaten meal and neatly stored belongings is utterly incompatible with the frenzy of a monster attack, while the image of a kraken dragging a ship to its doom makes for a thrilling fireside tale. The reality of the Mary Celeste's condition firmly closes the book on this particular chapter of her legend. Another powerful and frighteningly plausible natural explanation lies in the violent and unpredictable force of a waterspout. Picture a tornado, but one that forms over the ocean, a dark, swirling column of cloud and water vapor descending from the sky to meet the churning sea below. These maritime whirlwinds are not mere figments of legend. They are a documented and dangerous meteorological phenomenon, capable of generating winds strong enough to shred sails, snap masts, and inflict severe structural damage on any vessel caught in their path. For a crew in the middle of the Atlantic, the sudden appearance of a waterspout on the horizon would be a sight to inspire pure terror, a direct and visible threat from nature itself. Now, let's place the Mary Celeste into this scenario. The ship is sailing through the waters near the Azores, a region known for its volatile and rapidly changing weather. The sky darkens, the wind picks up, and a waterspout forms, not necessarily making a direct hit on the hull, but passing close enough to create absolute chaos. The sound alone would have been deafening, a roaring, shrieking whirlwind combined with the violent impact of water being thrown against the wooden planks of the ship. The entire vessel would have shuddered and vibrated as if it were being shaken apart by a giant, invisible hand. From below deck, this cacophony and the sensation of the ship groaning under immense stress could have easily been misinterpreted. The crew, including the experienced Captain Briggs, might have believed the ship had been holed, that her timbers were splintering, and that she was taking on water and about to sink beneath their feet. This theory provides a compelling explanation for one of the most puzzling pieces of evidence: the significant amount of water found sloshing in the ship's bilge. A close encounter with a waterspout could have deluged the deck with a massive volume of water in a very short amount of time. This water would have naturally drained down into the bilge, accounting for the higher than normal level reported by the boarding party. The disassembled pump found on deck also fits perfectly into this narrative. The crew, fighting for their lives, could have been frantically trying to clear a blockage or repair the pump to deal with the sudden influx of water, only to abandon the task when they became convinced the ship was doomed. The perceived immediacy of the danger, the belief that the hull was compromised, would have made pumping seem like a futile effort against an inevitable sinking. In the face of such a perceived catastrophe, the decision to abandon ship becomes not just understandable but logical. The primary duty of any captain is the preservation of life. If Benjamin Briggs truly believed the Mary Celeste was breaking apart and destined for the bottom of the ocean within minutes, his only responsible course of action would have been to get his crew and family into the lifeboat with all possible speed. The panic would have been controlled but urgent, a race against time. They would have grabbed the ship's papers and the navigational sextant, essential for their survival and identification once they reached land, and launched the yawl. In their minds, they weren't abandoning a sound vessel, they were escaping a sinking one. They likely tethered the lifeboat to the larger ship, expecting to ride out the squall at a safe distance and then watch the Mary Celeste slip beneath the waves. The tragic irony, of course, is that the ship did not sink. A waterspout's fury, while terrifying, is often brief. The torrent of water it dumped on the deck was just that, water on the deck, not a fatal breach of the hull. The Mary Celeste, a sturdily built brigantine, weathered the storm. The noise and vibration subsided, and the ship, though wet and battered, remained perfectly seaworthy. But by then, the lifeboat was already in the water. The real disaster likely struck afterward. The same turbulent seas that spawned the waterspout could have easily snapped the tow line connecting the small, overloaded lifeboat to the mother ship. Or a large wave could have swamped the yawl, casting its 10 occupants into the frigid Atlantic. The Mary Celeste, freed from its burden, then sailed on as a ghost ship, a cruel monument to a desperate gamble forced upon its crew by a terrifying and ultimately survivable act of nature. Let us return once more to the most scientifically grounded explanation, the theory of the alcohol fumes, but this time with a finer lens, examining not just the general idea but the precise chain of physical events that could have unfolded within the wooden hull of the Mary Celeste. The cargo was denatured ethanol, a liquid that, despite being mixed with unpleasant chemicals to make it undrinkable, still retains its fundamental property of volatility. In the confined, unventilated space of the ship's hold, the true danger wasn't the liquid itself, but the invisible vapor it releases. As the ship sailed from the cool November air of New York into the warmer, fluctuating temperatures of the mid-Atlantic, the 1,700 wooden barrels would have begun to breathe. The staves of the barrels expanded in the heat, and as they cooled again, they contracted. This natural, rhythmic process is not a flaw, but a characteristic of wooden cask construction. However, with each cycle, a small amount of vapor could be forced out through the porous wood or the seams between the staves. Over days, these minuscule, individual exhalations from hundreds of barrels could have accumulated, gradually building an atmosphere rich with ethanol fumes in the upper part of the hold. For a captain of Benjamin Briggs's experience and caution, the first sign of trouble might not have been a dramatic hiss or a visible leak, but something far more subtle and insidious, a faint, sweetly chemical odor detected by a crewman during a routine check of the bilge. Or perhaps it was a sound, a low, groaning creak from a barrel under pressure that was misinterpreted in the tense silence of the ship. The human response to a potential gas explosion is deeply rooted in a primal fear of invisible, instantaneous annihilation. Unlike a storm you can see coming or a fire you can fight, a vapor cloud offers no warning before it ignites. A single spark from a struck tool, a lantern flame, or even static electricity could theoretically trigger a blast capable of blowing the deck off the ship and turning the entire vessel into a fireball. For a man with his wife and 2-year-old daughter sleeping in cabins just above that hold, the mere suspicion of such a scenario would have been psychologically unbearable. The rational calculation for Briggs would have been stark and immediate. The risk of staying was an unthinkable catastrophe, while the risk of leaving was a manageable, if serious, maritime emergency. This is where the physical evidence aligns so powerfully with the theory. The discovery of the main hatch covers removed and lying on the deck is no longer a bizarre act, but a deliberate and logical safety procedure. The crew, under Briggs's orders, would have wrestled those heavy wooden lids off to desperately ventilate the hold, to let the sea wind sweep through and dilute the dangerous fumes. The sounding rod found nearby makes perfect sense. Someone was likely trying to determine if the seepage was also causing any unusual water accumulation, checking the bilge for both liquid and vapor threats. The broken peak halyard, the rope used for the frontmost sail, also fits this narrative of a controlled but urgent emergency. In the rush to launch the lifeboat and put a safe distance between themselves and what they believed was a floating bomb, the crew might have hastily cut or accidentally snapped that line, perhaps to quickly rig a sail on the small yawl itself. Every action points toward a crew operating under a clear, terrifying directive: get off the ship now, but do so with the intention of returning. The abandonment, therefore, was almost certainly a precaution, not a panic. They took the ship's navigational sextant and the official logbook and papers because they expected to need them. They were not casting themselves adrift to an unknown fate. They were executing a well-established maritime drill for such emergencies. The standard procedure would have been to launch the lifeboat and tether it to the much larger Mary Celeste with a long, strong tow line, perhaps a hawser hundreds of feet long. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. They would follow the mother ship at a safe distance, waiting and watching. If the fumes dissipated without incident, they would simply climb back aboard and continue their voyage. If the ship exploded, they would be far enough away to survive the blast and then begin the arduous road toward the Azores, which they knew were not impossibly far. In their minds, this was the safest possible choice, a temporary inconvenience to avert almost certain death. The final, tragic twist in this logical sequence is the one element that transformed a survival plan into a death sentence. The tow line broke. We can picture the scene. The Mary Celeste, under her partial set of sails, continues to move through the water, pulling the heavily laden lifeboat behind her like a tired fish on a line. The North Atlantic in late November is a restless, powerful place. A sudden squall could have whipped up the seas, placing immense strain on that critical rope. A large, rogue wave could have snapped it cleanly, or the constant chafing of the line against the ship's sharp railing could have worn it down strand by strand until it parted with a sickening crack. For the 10 people in the small boat, the moment of that break would have been one of pure horror. They would have watched helplessly as the solid, familiar shape of their ship, their shelter, their storehouse of food and water, their only real hope, began to sail away from them. They might have shouted, waved, even tried to row after her, but a brigantine under even a little canvas will always outpace an overloaded lifeboat being rowed against the wind and current. The Mary Celeste, the very object of their fear, drifted off into the haze, becoming a speck on the horizon, and then vanishing entirely, leaving them alone in a vast and empty ocean. The explosion they so desperately feared never happened. The phantom threat proved to be just that, a phantom, while the very real and ancient perils of the sea claimed them instead. Now let's turn to a theory that is both profoundly simple and deeply human, one that hinges not on monsters or mutiny, but on the fallibility of a captain under pressure. Consider the possibility of a cascading series of small mistakes, a chain of errors that began with a faulty instrument and ended in a catastrophic misinterpretation of the ship's true situation. The final log entry on the slate placed the Mary Celeste near the Azores, a rugged and unforgiving chain of islands. Navigating these waters required precision, especially for a captain like Benjamin Briggs, whose primary concern was the safety of his family. Imagine him below deck, leaning over his charts, trying to reconcile the ship's recorded position with what he was seeing, or more importantly, what he was hearing from his crew. A crewman might have reported an unusually high reading of water in the bilge, a finding based on the ship's sounding rod, a long marked pole used to measure the depth of water that has accumulated in the very bottom of the hull. What if that rod itself was defective? A crack or a warp in the wood could have given a false, alarmingly high reading, suggesting the ship was taking on water far more rapidly than it actually was. In the mind of a conscientious captain, a single piece of bad data can quickly spiral into a narrative of impending doom. This false alarm about flooding would have been terrifying enough on its own, but when paired with another potential misjudgment, it could have created a perfect storm of panic. The crew knew they were in the vicinity of the Azores, but accurate navigation in the 19th century was an art, not a science. It relied on clear skies for celestial observations and precise timekeeping. What if, due to overcast conditions or a simple miscalculation, Captain Briggs believed the ship was significantly closer to the rocky shore of Santa Maria Island than it actually was? He would have been looking at his charts, seeing a position that put him in what he thought was dangerously shallow water. Now combine that perceived navigational error with the faulty-sounding rod's report of rising water in the bilge. His logical conclusion would have been chillingly straightforward. The Mary Celeste had run aground on an unseen reef or shoal. The ship, in his mind, was holed and starting to sink, and the pounding of the Atlantic swells against the hull would have sounded like the death knell of his vessel breaking apart on the rocks. For a man with his wife and child aboard, the imperative would have been immediate and absolute: abandon ship before it went down and drag them all with it. This theory explains the scene of controlled chaos found by the boarding party with heartbreaking clarity. The disassembled pump makes perfect sense. The crew was likely trying frantically to clear a blockage or repair it to combat the non-existent flooding. The open hatch covers could be interpreted as a desperate attempt to access the bilge directly, to see the damage they believed was there. The decision to launch the lifeboat becomes not an act of fear, but one of grim necessity. They were escaping a sinking ship, or so they thought. They took the navigational sextant and the ship's papers because they fully intended to navigate their small boat to the safety of the Azores, which they believed were just a short row away. In their minds, they were making the only logical choice to save their lives from a ship moments from foundering. The tragedy is that both of the critical data points they based this life or death decision on were wrong. The ship wasn't sinking, and they were not nearly as close to land as they believed. Their world had been upended by a phantom crisis, a disaster that existed only in the flawed information presented by their instruments and their charts. The true horror of this scenario lies in its psychological plausibility. We are not talking about a cowardly or incompetent captain. We are discussing a highly respected professional making a critical decision under extreme stress with imperfect and misleading information. The pressure in that moment would have been immense: the sounds of the ship groaning, the shouted reports from his crew, the terrified eyes of his wife and daughter. In such a high-stakes environment, the human brain seeks patterns and jumps to conclusions to resolve uncertainty. The combination of a high water reading and a suspected navigational error created a pattern that pointed irresistibly toward one conclusion: imminent sinking. This is a phenomenon modern psychologists might call a catastrophic cognitive cascade, where one piece of bad data validates another, creating a feedback loop of fear that overrides more cautious, deliberate judgment. Benjamin Briggs was likely a victim of this very process, his vast experience and steady temperament overwhelmed by a perfect storm of false alarms. Ultimately, this theory paints the disappearance of the Mary Celeste's crew as one of the most poignant maritime tragedies imaginable. They were not lost to a supernatural force or a violent act, but to a simple, heartbreaking miscommunication between man and his tools. They fled from a danger that was not real, only to be delivered into the very real and unforgiving embrace of the open ocean. The ship they abandoned in such haste, believing it to be seconds from the seabed, sailed on for days as a silent, mocking testament to their fatal error. It is a reminder that sometimes the greatest mysteries are born not from malice or the unknown, but from a single, critical misreading of the world, a mistake that, once made, could never be unmade. While we've explored external threats and tragic misjudgments, there is a darker, more human theory that points the finger of blame not at the sea, but at deliberate human greed. This is the insurance fraud hypothesis, a conspiratorial narrative that suggests the entire disappearance was an elaborate scam orchestrated by the ship's owners to cash in on a valuable policy. To understand this theory, we need to look at the financial backdrop of the Mary Celeste's final voyage. The ship was owned by a partnership led by James H. Winchester, but the theory often focuses on the minority owners, a pair of New York businessmen named the Burholms, though historical records more accurately point to a man named Sylvester Goodwin as being involved in the ownership group with Winchester. Regardless of the specific names, the financial situation was indeed precarious. The Mary Celeste was an old vessel, and the cost of her most recent repairs and refit had been substantial, putting a significant strain on her owner's finances. She was, in essence, a floating liability that needed to prove her worth. The mechanics of the proposed fraud are straightforward. The theory posits that the owners, perhaps in collusion with Captain Briggs, conspired to abandon the ship at sea in a pre-arranged location. Another vessel, secretly working with them, would then rendezvous with the lifeboat, pick up the crew and the Briggs family, and secretly transport them to safety. The Mary Celeste, left to drift, would eventually be declared lost at sea, and the owners would collect a hefty insurance payout on both the vessel and its cargo, which was also heavily insured. For this to work, Captain Briggs would have to be a willing participant, agreeing to stage the abandonment and fake the deaths of himself, his family, and his entire crew. Proponents of this theory argue that Briggs's noted piety was a cover, and that the presence of his family was merely a clever ruse to make the voyage appear completely normal and above suspicion, thereby deflecting any future investigation. On the surface, there are a few circumstantial details that seem to lend this idea a flicker of credibility. The insurance policy on the Mary Celeste and her cargo was undeniably large for the time. Furthermore, the fact that the Dei Gratia, captained by David Morehouse, a known acquaintance of Briggs, was the ship that found the derelict has fueled speculation of a planned rendezvous that somehow went awry. Could the two captains have been in on the scheme together? The theory suggests that the plan was for the Dei Gratia to find the empty Mary Celeste, claim salvage rights, and split the profits with the owners, a payoff far more lucrative than a simple captain's salary. The failure of the plan, according to this narrative, was that the Dei Gratia arrived too late, or a storm separated the lifeboat from the Mary Celeste before the rendezvous could occur, leading to the very real deaths of all involved and leaving Morehouse to stumble upon the ghost ship and trigger an official inquiry he never wanted. However, when we weigh this theory against the known character of Benjamin Briggs and the immense personal cost, it collapses under the weight of its own cynical logic. Let's start with the man himself. Every single piece of evidence from those who knew him paints a portrait of a man of unwavering integrity and deep religious conviction. This was not a gambler or a desperate charlatan. He was a respected member of his community from a family of master mariners. To believe he was capable of such a scheme, one must also believe he was a monster who would willingly risk the life of his beloved 2-year-old daughter, Sophia, in a dangerous small boat transfer on the open ocean as part of a criminal conspiracy. The idea is not just unlikely, it is a complete violation of everything we know about his personality and his clear devotion to his family. His decision to bring his wife and child was a testament to his confidence and normalcy, not a hallmark of a complex plot. Furthermore, the practical execution of such a fraud stretches believability to its breaking point. It would have required the silent, unanimous cooperation of 7 other crew members, including the steadfast first mate Albert Richardson, a family man with his own reputation to uphold. The odds of keeping such a conspiracy secret among 10 people, especially when it involved faking their own deaths and disappearing forever, are astronomically low. Someone would have talked or left a letter or confessed on their deathbed. In the 150 years since the event, not a single shred of documentary evidence, no hidden letters, no secret bank accounts, no deathbed confessions from any of the alleged conspirators, has ever emerged to support this theory. The official inquiry in Gibraltar, for all its suspicion of the Dei Gratia's crew, never found a financial motive or a paper trail linking Captain Briggs to the owners in a criminal plot. Ultimately, the insurance fraud theory tells us more about our own fascination with cynical explanations than it does about the fate of the Mary Celeste. It is a story born in the Gilded Age of robber barons and get-rich-quick schemes, where it was easier for some to believe in a complex criminal plot than in a simple, tragic accident. But when we look at the human heart of the story, at Benjamin Briggs reading the Bible to his crew, at Sarah Briggs sewing in her cabin, at a toddler's toys scattered on the floor, the idea of a premeditated scam feels not only unsupported by evidence, but deeply disrespectful to the memory of 10 people who almost certainly met a terrifying and undeserved end in the cold, vast Atlantic. They were victims of the sea, not participants in a sinister financial scheme. But the story of the Mary Celeste, as we know it today, was not forged solely in the courtrooms of Gibraltar or the silent expanse of the Atlantic. It was also shaped profoundly in the mind of a young Scottish doctor, an aspiring writer who would one day create the world's most famous detective. In 1884, more than a decade after the ship was found, Arthur Conan Doyle published a short story titled J. Habakkuk Jeffson's statement in the prestigious Cornhill magazine. This single work of fiction did more to cement the ship's legend in the public consciousness than any newspaper report or official inquiry ever could. But in doing so, it took a real tragedy and twisted it almost beyond recognition into a sensational and deeply problematic Gothic tale. Conan Doyle, still years away from the global fame that Sherlock Holmes would bring him, took immense creative liberties with the known facts. The most immediate and lasting change was the ship's very name. In his story, he called her the Mary Celeste. This subtle alteration, a more elegant French-sounding spelling, was a fiction writer's flourish, but it stuck with a tenacity that has infuriated historians ever since. To this day, a significant portion of the public knows the vessel by this incorrect fictional name, a testament to the power of a compelling story to overwrite historical record. But this was merely the cosmetic change. The plot of his narrative dove into far darker and more invented territory. Conan Doyle's story presented a first-person account from a sole survivor, Dr. Jeffson, who describes a horrifying sequence of events involving a mysterious, charismatic mixed-race passenger named Septimus Goring. In this fictional version, Goring orchestrates a bloody mutiny and massacre of the entire crew and the captain's family, motivated by a fanatical desire to seek revenge for the historical injustices of slavery and to sail the ship back to an African utopia. The story is filled with elements that had no basis in the real investigation: coded messages, a sacred tribal stone, and a premeditated plot fueled by racial vengeance. For the late Victorian readership, this concoction of maritime mystery, exotic villainy, and brutal violence was irresistible. The story was an immediate sensation, but its impact was profoundly distorting. Because Conan Doyle presented it in the form of a realistic first-hand testimony and published it anonymously, many readers and even some newspapers accepted J. Habakkuk Jeffson's statement not as fiction, but as a genuine, newly uncovered solution to the real mystery. The damage to the historical narrative was immense and permanent. Conan Doyle's thrilling but entirely fabricated tale introduced two poisonous ideas into the Mary Celeste legend that have proven incredibly difficult to eradicate. The first was the notion of a violent, racially charged mutiny. His portrayal of Septimus Goring as a cunning and vengeful figure tapped into deep-seated racial prejudices of the era, creating a sinister, foreign antagonist where none had existed in the real evidence. This provided a simple, dramatic villain for the public to latch onto, steering speculation away from the more complex and plausible theories involving natural phenomena or tragic accident. The second poisonous idea was the presence of a sole, enigmatic survivor. The real Mary Celeste had no survivors, no one to give any statement at all. But Conan Doyle's invention of Dr. Jeffson created a template for endless hoaxes and false claims in the years that followed, as various individuals would occasionally step forward claiming to be the lone survivor of the ordeal, their fabricated stories often borrowing heavily from the structure of the very fiction that had inspired them. The author himself later expressed some amusement at how completely his story had been accepted as fact, noting that it was even cited as a true account by some maritime authorities. Yet, the consequences of his creative license were far from amusing for the historical record. The real, grieving families of Benjamin Briggs, his family, and his crew had to endure not only the pain of their loss but also the spectacle of their loved one's memory being traduced in popular fiction, transformed into characters in a lurid tale of murder and conspiracy. The quiet, devout Captain Briggs was now shadowed in the public imagination by the fictional specter of a mutinous crew. The orderly, mysterious abandonment was overwritten by a narrative of bloody slaughter. Arthur Conan Doyle, with the undeniable power of a great storyteller, had taken a granite block of historical fact and carved it into a dramatic, captivating, but ultimately false statue. He gave the world a more exciting story, but in doing so, he ensured that the true, tragic mystery of the Mary Celeste would forever have to fight its way through a thick forest of his own imaginative creation. After the Gibraltar inquiry failed to produce any definitive answers, the Mary Celeste was released to her owners. She was no longer just a ship, she was now a floating legend, a vessel permanently stained by an inexplicable tragedy. This notoriety made her a commercial pariah. What captain would want to command a ship known as a ghost vessel? What crew would willingly sign onto a hoodoo ship, a floating bad omen? For the next 13 years, the Mary Celeste passed through a succession of no fewer than 17 different owners, a rapid and telling turnover that speaks volumes about her cursed reputation. Each new owner hoped to profit from the sturdy brigantine, only to find her name alone was enough to scare away business and crew. She became a maritime leper, shunned by the very community that had once been her home. The shadow of 1872 stretched long behind her, ensuring that every voyage was undertaken under a cloud of superstition and whispered fear. Her career became a slow, painful decline, a series of misfortunes that only reinforced her unlucky status. She hauled low-profit cargoes to obscure ports, often underinsured and poorly maintained. In 1880, a new owner, a man from Boston, invested a significant sum in repairs, hoping to break the curse through sheer investment. It didn't work. On a voyage to Montevideo, she was struck by a sudden squall that ripped her sails and damaged her rigging, forcing a costly and lengthy layover for repairs that devoured the owner's profits. Later, while loading timber in the Bay of Fundy, a poorly secured load shifted in a swell, crushing a crewman and requiring another expensive delay. It seemed the ship itself was rejecting any attempt at redemption. The name Mary Celeste had become a self-fulfilling prophecy of bad luck. Sailors would cross themselves when she sailed into port, and owners would sell her at a loss just to be rid of the psychological and financial burden she represented. The final, fittingly dramatic act in the life of the Mary Celeste began in 1884, when she was purchased for a paltry sum by a consortium of Massachusetts-based investors. The key figure in this group was Captain Gilman C. Parker, a seasoned but financially struggling mariner who saw in the derelict vessel not a curse, but an opportunity for one last lucrative payday. The plan was simple, criminal, and brutally pragmatic. They would deliberately wreck the ship and file a fraudulent insurance claim. The Mary Celeste, once the center of a genuine mystery, was now to be the star of a manufactured one. Parker and his co-conspirators took out a heavily inflated insurance policy on the old brigantine, far exceeding her actual scrap value. Then, in late 1884, they set sail from Boston, ostensibly for a routine cargo run to the Caribbean, but with a secret, singular destination in mind, a treacherous, isolated coral reef off the coast of Haiti. The execution of the scheme was as reckless as it was cynical. Captain Parker sailed the Mary Celeste directly toward the dangerous Rocheleau Bank, a shallow, razor-sharp underwater reef known as a graveyard for ships. He and his hand-picked, complicit crew then intentionally ran the vessel hard aground, smashing her hull open on the coral. They made a perfunctory attempt to make it look like an accident, but their actions were transparent. After ensuring the ship was irreparably holed and taking to their lifeboats, they were picked up by a pre-arranged schooner and taken to safety, leaving the Mary Celeste to be pounded to pieces by the relentless Caribbean surf. They then filed their insurance claim, presenting the wreck as a tragic navigational error, expecting a swift and sizable payout from the underwriters. But the conspiracy unraveled with almost poetic justice. The insurance companies were immediately suspicious. The wreck site was so blatantly, obviously off any standard shipping lane that the story of a simple navigational mistake was laughable. An investigation was launched, and under pressure, one of the crewmen cracked, confessing to the entire plot. Captain Gilman Parker and his associates were arrested and put on trial for conspiracy to commit barratry, the deliberate destruction of a ship for insurance money. The trial was a national sensation, not because of the crime itself, but because of the infamous vessel at its heart. Newspapers had a field day, portraying the event as the final, sordid chapter in the life of the world's most famous ghost ship. In the end, the legal outcome was frustratingly lenient. Captain Parker and his co-conspirators were convicted, but their sentences were light, primarily fines and short prison terms. They had succeeded in destroying the Mary Celeste, but they failed to profit from her destruction. And so, on that remote Haitian reef in 1885, the physical story of the Mary Celeste came to an end. The waves that had once cradled her as a crewless enigma now finished the job, breaking her battered hull apart and scattering her timbers across the coral. It was a conclusion as dark and cynical as her central mystery was profound and haunting. The ship that had captivated the world with its story of 10 vanished souls was itself vanished in a sordid plot of greed. Her two great mysteries, the first, a genuine, heartbreaking puzzle of the sea, and the second, a tawdry, man-made crime, stand in stark contrast. One speaks to the terrifying power of nature and the fragility of human life, the other to the petty corruptibility of man. The Mary Celeste was, from her first moment in the spotlight to her very last, a vessel forever defined by the unknown, leaving us not with answers, but with an enduring legacy of questions that continue to echo across the centuries. The passage of time did little to diminish the allure of the Mary Celeste, but it did provide new tools for investigation. As the world moved into the 20th century, the mystery began to attract a different kind of sleuth, not sailors or lawyers, but scientists and historians armed with modern forensics and a determination to cut through the layers of myth. The most poignant of these modern inquiries was led by a man with a deeply personal connection to the tragedy, Dr. Oliver Cobb, a respected physician and the first cousin of Captain Benjamin Briggs's wife, Sarah. For Cobb, this was not merely an intellectual puzzle, it was a family story, a haunting legacy he felt compelled to understand. In the 1940s, he embarked on a decades-long quest, meticulously gathering every surviving document, log entry, and court transcript related to the case. His work, published in the 1942 book, The Mary Celeste, The Odyssey of an Abandoned Ship, became the foundational text for all future research, meticulously separating the documented facts from the wild fiction of Conan Doyle and the penny press. Later researchers, building on Cobb's painstaking groundwork, turned to the principles of chemistry and naval architecture to put the dominant theories to the test. A key focus was, of course, the cargo of denatured alcohol. In the late 20th century, laboratory analyses were conducted to precisely recreate the conditions inside the Mary Celeste's hold. Scientists filled period-accurate wooden barrels with the same type of industrial alcohol and subjected them to the temperature fluctuations of a transatlantic voyage. The results were revealing. While the barrels did indeed breathe, releasing fumes as the wood expanded and contracted, the rate of vapor release was generally slow and steady. More importantly, the denaturing agents mixed into the alcohol, chemicals like methanol and pyridine, actually made the fumes less volatile, not more. For an explosion to occur, the vapor would need to reach a very specific concentration in the air, the lower explosive limit, and then encounter a spark or open flame. The modern scientific consensus suggests that while the fumes would have produced a strong, alarming odor, the likelihood of them accumulating to a critically explosive level in the vast, open space of the ship's hold was actually quite low. The perceived danger was real in the minds of the crew, but the actual physical danger was far less imminent than anyone had assumed for over a century. This scientific re-evaluation forced a shift in perspective. If a cataclysmic explosion was statistically improbable, then what Captain Briggs and his crew likely experienced was what we might now call a phantom threat. Imagine the psychological pressure. The ship is rolling, its timbers groaning. A crewman reports a potent, unfamiliar chemical smell from the hold. In the tense atmosphere, every normal creak and groan of the working vessel could be misinterpreted as the prelude to a blast. For a cautious captain responsible for his family, the mere possibility of such a catastrophe, however remote, could have been enough to trigger the ultimate gamble. The modern view, therefore, reframes the abandonment not as a flight from a certain disaster, but as a desperate precaution against a terrifying but ultimately phantom risk. Further insights came from naval architects and engineers who studied the structural design of brigantines like the Mary Celeste. They modeled how such a ship would handle taking on water, and their analysis sheds new light on the reported 3.5 feet of water in the bilge. While this sounds like a massive amount, these experts calculated that for a vessel of her size and design, this volume of water would not have been nearly enough to sink her or even make her unseaworthy. It was, however, more than enough to be alarming, especially if the crew believed it was rising rapidly. The disassembled pump, once seen as a baffling anomaly, now fits into a clearer narrative. The crew was likely fighting what they thought was a losing battle against flooding, only to abandon the repair in the face of what they believed was a greater, more immediate danger from the fumes. The combination of the two perceived threats, flooding and explosion, created a perfect storm of panic, a catastrophic convergence of misdiagnosed problems that made the radical decision to abandon a sound ship feel like the only logical choice. Despite these significant advances, modern science has fallen short of delivering a single, definitive answer. It has instead provided a more nuanced and in many ways more tragic understanding of the event. We now know that the ship was not on the verge of exploding. We know it was not sinking. The modern re-examination has effectively ruled out the most dramatic physical causes, leaving us with a deeper appreciation for the human drama that unfolded. The mystery of the Mary Celeste is no longer a whodunit, but a heartbreaking story of why. Why did an experienced, devout, and careful man make a decision that, with the benefit of modern science, we can see was almost certainly a fatal error in judgment? The answer lies in the terrifying power of perceived danger, the limits of 19th century knowledge, and the immense pressure of commanding a ship with your own family sleeping in the cabins below. Science has cleared away the fog of myth and conspiracy, but in doing so, it has revealed the core of the tragedy. 10 people were likely lost not to a monster or a mutiny, but to a terrible, understandable, and ultimately preventable mistake. From that moment of its discovery, the story of the Mary Celeste proved to be far too potent to remain confined to maritime logs and court transcripts. It quickly escaped into the wider world of popular imagination, becoming a narrative vessel in its own right, endlessly refitted and repurposed to sail through the currents of our collective psyche. Its transformation from a specific, tragic incident into a universal archetype began almost immediately, fueled by the very same sensationalist press that had covered the Gibraltar hearings. The basic, bone-chilling facts were a publisher's dream: a seaworthy ship, a missing crew, an unfinished meal, a child's toys. It was a ready-made ghost story requiring no embellishment, yet irresistible to embellish. The public craved answers where there were none, and in that vacuum of certainty, myth rushed in to fill the void. The Mary Celeste ceased to be just a ship and became the ghost ship, the definitive template for every mysterious derelict that would follow in folklore and fiction. This archetypal status is perhaps its most significant cultural contribution. When we now picture a ghost ship, the image that forms is almost invariably a version of the Mary Celeste. A vessel silent and adrift, its sails tattered, its decks empty, a monument to a vanished human world. This powerful imagery has been codified in countless works across every medium. In literature, it has inspired everything from direct fictionalized accounts to more oblique homages. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's early and influential story, despite its factual inaccuracies, set a precedent for using the ship as a springboard for mystery and suspense. Later, science fiction master Arthur C. Clarke penned a haunting short story, The Pacific, which depicted a future where the Mary Celeste is found again, preserved in a block of ice, a timeless relic of human mystery. The ship has sailed into poems and novels, each author using its empty decks as a stage for their own dramas of isolation, fear, and the unknown. The visual media of film and television have found the Mary Celeste story equally compelling. The iconic opening of the 1935 horror classic, The Mystery of the Mary Celeste, starring Bela Lugosi, powerfully, if fictionally, depicted a mutinous massacre, cementing the violent mutiny theory in the public mind for a generation. The ship made a memorable appearance in a 1964 episode of the British science fiction show, Doctor Who, where the Time Lord and his companions investigate the derelict only to discover the crew has been abducted by aliens. A wonderfully inventive solution that speaks to our desire to project extraterrestrial explanations onto earthly mysteries. Even the animated series Futurama featured its own hilarious take, with the crew discovering a spaceship named the Mary Celeste, whose alien crew had similarly vanished. Each adaptation, whether playing it straight for scares or for laughs, reinforces the core ingredients of the legend: the emptiness, the mystery, the unsettling preservation of a life interrupted. Beyond direct portrayals, the Mary Celeste's DNA is woven into the fabric of countless other stories. The entire genre of haunted ship tales, from the Flying Dutchman to the modern horror film Ghost Ship, owes a profound debt to the chilling precedent set by this very real event. The concept of a Mary Celeste scenario, a finding a place or a vehicle fully operational but completely devoid of people, has become a standard trope in post-apocalyptic fiction and mystery writing. It taps into a deep-seated fear of abandonment and the uncanny, the terror of a world that continues to function perfectly without us. When a story needs a quick and powerful symbol for the inexplicable, for a mystery that defies logic, the ghost of the Mary Celeste is often summoned. Its name is a shorthand, an instantly recognizable emblem of the unknown. This enduring fascination raises a compelling question. Why does this particular story, among so many other maritime tragedies, hold such a powerful and permanent grip on us? The answer lies in the profound human anxieties it embodies. The ocean itself is the ultimate unknown, a vast, trackless wilderness that represents the limits of our control and understanding. The Mary Celeste is a perfect metaphor for our vulnerability in the face of that immense, impersonal power. Its crew didn't vanish in a storm we can comprehend. They were erased by something silent, something we cannot see or name. This touches a primal fear of being utterly and completely lost, of stepping off the solid deck of the known world into an abyss that offers no explanation. Furthermore, the ship serves as a stark memento mori, a reminder of the fragility of human life and the suddenness with which it can be extinguished. The poignant domestic details, the sewing machine, the child's toys, the half-eaten meal, make the tragedy intensely human and relatable. It's not just a story of sailors, it's a story of a family, of people like us, whose ordinary lives were catastrophically interrupted. This transforms the mystery from a historical curiosity into a personal nightmare. It forces us to confront the unsettling possibility that our own ordered world could be just as easily and inexplicably undone. The Mary Celeste is a blank canvas, and what we paint onto it are our own deepest fears. Fear of the unseen, fear of abandonment, and the haunting fear that the greatest mysteries of life and death may never yield their secrets. It endures not because we have solved it, but precisely because we cannot. What truly cements the Mary Celeste in our collective consciousness is the powerful and unsettling combination of its core components, a perfect storm of narrative elements that taps directly into our deepest psychological fascinations. At its heart, this isn't a story about a ship, it's a story about people. The presence of Captain Briggs's family transforms the mystery from a professional maritime disaster into a profound human tragedy. We can all relate to the domestic scenes frozen in time, the half-eaten meal, the sewing machine, the child's toys scattered on the floor. These aren't abstract clues, they are artifacts of a life we recognize, a family home that was violently and inexplicably vacated. This relatability makes the event feel immediate and personal, even a century and a half later. We aren't just wondering what happened to a crew of sailors, we are asking what could possibly terrify a father so much that he would rush his wife and baby into a tiny lifeboat in the middle of the ocean. The human drama is the emotional anchor that makes the intellectual puzzle so compelling. Adding to its unique power is the complete and utter absence of a clear antagonist or a single, definitive witness. Most great mysteries have a villain, a murderer, a traitor, a monster. The Mary Celeste offers none. There is no mustache-twirling pirate, no vengeful mutineer, no sea beast with a taste for human flesh that can be conveniently blamed. The ship itself, with its silent, stubborn refusal to sink, becomes the only character, and it gives up no confession. This lack of a villain forces the mystery inward, making the sea, the weather, or even the human mind itself the potential antagonist. We are left confronting an impersonal, almost existential threat. Furthermore, there were no survivors to provide a testimony, no last message scratched into a plank. This total void of first-hand account creates a vacuum of information that our imaginations are compelled to fill. We are not interpreting a conflicting story, we are building a story from absolute silence, and that creative process is endlessly engaging. Then there are the clues themselves, a collection of physical evidence that is both tantalizing and utterly inconclusive. It's a detective story where every piece of evidence points in a different direction, yet none leads to a final solution. The open hatch suggests ventilation for fumes, but the intact cargo argues against a major leak. The disassembled pump implies a fight against flooding, but the sound hull proves the ship wasn't sinking. The missing lifeboat indicates a planned abandonment, but the untouched personal belongings and full water supply defy the logic of a desperate flight. Each clue is a door that seems to open onto an answer, only to reveal another corridor of questions. This is the essence of a great puzzle. It provides just enough pieces to convince us a solution is possible, but not enough to actually complete the picture. Our brains are wired to seek patterns and resolve ambiguity, and the Mary Celeste presents the ultimate challenge to that cognitive drive, a riddle that perpetually engages our problem-solving instincts without ever offering the satisfaction of a solution. In our modern age of instant information and forensic science, we have become accustomed to answers. Cold cases are solved with DNA evidence, shipwrecks are found with sonar mapping, and satellites can track a single container across the entire ocean. We live in an era that has largely demystified the world. The Mary Celeste stands as a magnificent exception to this rule. It is a genuine, enduring historical enigma that has resisted every attempt at a definitive explanation, from the 19th century courtroom to 21st century scientific modeling. This persistence in the face of all our advanced knowledge is both humbling and thrilling. It serves as a reminder that there are still stories from our past that remain stubbornly opaque, mysteries that the passage of time and the advancement of technology have not been able to crack. The ship is a holdout from an age of true wonder, a tangible link to a time when the map still contained blank spaces marked, "Here be dragons." Ultimately, the story of the Mary Celeste endures because it is a mirror. We look at its empty decks and we see our own fears reflected back at us. The fear of the unknown, the fear of being lost, the fear of a catastrophe so sudden and complete that it leaves no time for a final goodbye. It is a canvas upon which we can project our anxieties about the sea, about technology, about the very stability of our own lives. The mystery is so powerful not in spite of its lack of an answer, but because of it. A solved mystery has an ending. It becomes a closed book. The Mary Celeste is a story that remains forever open, an eternal question mark on the horizon that continues to beckon us, generation after generation, to come closer, to look deeper, and to wonder. So, after piecing together all the evidence and examining every angle, where does that leave us? What are the most plausible scenarios for the final, terrifying moments aboard the Mary Celeste? The key is to focus on explanations that align with the specific clues left behind: the orderly state of the ship, the missing lifeboat and navigational instruments, and the complete absence of violence. The most compelling theories all point toward a single, tragic conclusion: that Captain Briggs made a rational decision to abandon a ship he believed was doomed, a decision based on a catastrophic misjudgment of the actual danger. One of the strongest and most consistent scenarios involves the cargo of industrial alcohol. Picture the scene. The ship is rolling through the Atlantic swell, and a crewman reports a potent chemical smell coming from the hold. Captain Briggs, a deeply cautious man with his family aboard, investigates. He might hear the creaking of the wooden barrels, a sound that could easily be misinterpreted as pressure building dangerously inside. In that moment, the fear is not of a simple fire, but of a cataclysmic explosion that could tear the ship apart in an instant. This perceived imminent threat provides a powerful motive for the abandonment. The crew, acting under orders, removes the hatch covers to ventilate the hold, explaining why they were found on deck. They grab the ship's papers and the sextant, fully intending to navigate their small boat to the nearby Azores. They launch the lifeboat, likely tethering it to the larger ship with a long line, expecting to follow at a safe distance until the danger passes. The tragedy in this scenario is that the explosion never happens. The leaking fumes, while alarming, never reach a critical concentration. The real disaster strikes when the tow line snaps in a squall, or the overloaded lifeboat is swamped by a large wave, leaving the crew to the mercy of the sea while the perfectly sound Mary Celeste sails on, a ghostly monument to their fatal miscalculation. Another highly plausible theory combines a few of the physical clues into a cascading emergency. Imagine that the crew was already dealing with a separate issue, such as a malfunctioning bilge pump. The pump was found disassembled, suggesting they were actively trying to clear a blockage or make a repair. At the same time, perhaps due to a faulty sounding rod or a simple misreading, they believe the ship is taking on water much faster than it actually is. Now add to this a navigational error. The last log entry placed them near the rugged coast of the Azores. If Captain Briggs believed they were in much shallower water than they actually were, the sound of the ship groaning in the swells could have been mistaken for the hull grinding on a reef. In his mind, the ship is holed, flooding, and breaking apart. The decision to abandon ship becomes not just logical, but imperative. They launch the lifeboat to escape what they believe is a sinking vessel, taking the navigational tools to find land, only to discover too late that the Mary Celeste was never in any real danger of foundering. They fled from a phantom, a disaster that existed only in the misinterpretation of their instruments and the terrifying sounds of the sea. What makes these scenarios more convincing than tales of piracy or mutiny is their consistency with the human elements of the story. Captain Briggs was not a reckless man. He was devout, responsible, and deeply protective of his family. A theory that relies on him panicking over nothing doesn't fit his character. but a theory that has him making a calculated, if tragically wrong, decision to save his loved ones from a threat he genuinely believed was real. That fits perfectly. It explains the lack of panic and the orderly abandonment. There was no time to grab personal belongings because the perceived danger was instantaneous and overwhelming. They didn't take more water because they believed they were only facing a short-term emergency, a quick dash away from a floating bomb or a fast ride to a nearby shore. The greatest tragedy of the Mary Celeste is that it was almost certainly a story of good seamanship and rational choices made in the face of bad information and misunderstood natural phenomena. The sea itself didn't claim them with a monster or a wave. It deceived them with its sounds and its vastness, leading a good captain to make the one decision that would ultimately cost everyone their lives. And so we are left at the edge of the known world, staring into the same expanse of ocean that met the crew of the day Gracia 150 years ago. The story of the Mary Celeste, when stripped of its fictional embellishments and sensational conspiracy theories, is built upon a foundation of simple, chilling facts. A perfectly sound ship was found sailing itself. Her crew, captain, and his entire family vanished without a trace. There was no sign of a struggle, no pirate raid, no monstrous attack from the deep. The vessel was a floating snapshot of a life violently interrupted, a home that had been suddenly and completely vacated. For over a century, we have sifted through those clues: the half-eaten meal, the missing lifeboat, the disassembled pump, the few leaking barrels of industrial alcohol, and each piece of evidence points toward a rational yet ultimately tragic sequence of events. The most compelling explanations all converge on the same heartbreaking conclusion. Captain Benjamin Briggs, a devout and deeply competent mariner, made a calculated decision to abandon what he believed was a doomed ship. Whether he was fleeing the phantom threat of an alcohol explosion, believed the hull was shattered on a reef, or was reacting to a cascading series of misunderstood emergencies, he acted to save the lives of his wife, his child, and his crew. The true, agonizing tragedy is that the danger was almost certainly an illusion. The Mary Celeste was never sinking, never about to explode. The ship they fled from in terror was in the end the only thing that could have saved them. The real mystery, then, is not what happened to the Mary Celeste, but what happened in the mind of a good man in a moment of unimaginable pressure, a decision made with the best of intentions that led 10 souls into the vast, waiting emptiness of the sea. The full truth of those final, desperate hours died with Benjamin Briggs, Sarah, little Sophia, and the 7 crewmen, their story swallowed by the Atlantic waves forever beyond our reach. This enduring enigma speaks to something far deeper than a simple historical puzzle. The Mary Celeste has become a permanent fixture in our cultural imagination because it is a perfect vessel for our most profound anxieties. It represents the fear of the unknown, the terror of being utterly and inexplicably lost. In a world where we can map the ocean floor with satellites and solve crimes with a single strand of DNA, the story of the Mary Celeste is a humbling reminder that some mysteries are stubbornly resistant to our modern tools of discovery. It is a holdout from an age of true wonder, a story that refuses to be neatly filed away and forgotten. The ship's empty decks are a canvas onto which we project our own fears of the sea's implacable power, of technology's failure, of the sudden and silent end of our own ordered lives. We are drawn to it because it forces us to confront the limits of our understanding and the haunting possibility that some questions are destined to remain unanswered, their secrets kept by time and tide. The legacy of the Mary Celeste is not one of fear but of fascination. It challenges us to be detectives, to look at the available evidence and piece together our own narrative from the silence. It invites us to consider the human drama at its core: the love of a family, the duty of a captain, the courage of a crew faced with an unimaginable choice. So now we pass the question to you, the final investigators in this century-old case. After journeying with us through the facts and the fictions, the plausible theories and the wild speculations, What do you believe was the catalyst for that fateful decision? Was it the fumes from the cargo, a mistaken belief that the ship was sinking, or a violent waterspout that created an illusion of catastrophe? Perhaps you have a theory of your own that we haven't even considered. The comment section below is your logbook. Share your thoughts, your deductions, and your own solutions to the world's greatest maritime mystery. The case of the Mary Celeste remains open, and your voice is now a part of its enduring story.